Look closely at this image. What do you see? Is it the faint, haunting impression of a man bearing the wounds of crucifixion, or something more? Could this ancient linen cloth, known as the Shroud of Turin, truly be the burial shroud of Jesus Christ? For centuries, this piece of fabric has captivated believers, scientists, and skeptics alike, standing as one of history's most mysterious and hotly debated religious artifacts. It's a relic wrapped in faith, shrouded in controversy, and surrounded by questions that challenge both science and spirit. Its very existence invites wonder, doubt, and an unshakable sense of awe, because if it is real, it would be nothing less than a divine snapshot of one of humanity's most pivotal moments. What makes the shroud so endlessly fascinating isn't just its age or its origin, it's the profound and intimate connection it suggests between the earthly and the eternal. Here is an object that seems to hold a sacred secret, a silent witness to suffering and resurrection. People from all walks of life have been drawn into its story, historians tracing its elusive journey through time, forensic experts analyzing every thread and fiber, and millions of pilgrims who view it not just as cloth but as testament. It's an artifact that doesn't simply belong to the past. It lives and breathes in the imagination of the present, inviting each of us to look closer and ask, what if? In this video, we're going to explore the Shroud of Turin in depth, unraveling its mysteries, diving into the scientific debates, and venturing into the heart of its enduring spiritual significance. We'll examine how a simple piece of linen became an object of global devotion and intense scrutiny, and why, after all this time, it continues to defy easy explanation. This isn't just a story about an ancient relic. It's a journey into faith, mystery, and the timeless human desire to touch the divine. So come along as we step into one of history's greatest enigmas and discover for yourself why the Shroud of Turin remains an unforgettable question mark at the intersection of belief and proof. Our story truly begins in the middle of the 14th century, not in the Holy Land but in a small town in France. It was in the year 1354 that the shroud makes its first clear appearance in the historical record, emerging in the town of Liari. Here, a knight named Geoffroy de Charny presented the linen cloth to the public, though the exact details of how he came to possess it remain one of the shroud's earliest mysteries. Was it a spoil of war brought back from the Crusades, a sacred gift from a powerful patron? The historical documents are silent on this point, leaving us with only speculation. From the very moment it was displayed, the cloth was a sensation, drawing pilgrims from across the region, but it was also immediately controversial. The image was so startling, so photographically precise for its time, that it inevitably raised eyebrows and suspicions. The controversy grew so loud that it reached the local Bishop of Troyes, Henry de Poitiers. He launched an investigation into the cloth's origins and, after speaking with the artist who he believed had created it, declared the shroud to be a cunning work of human hands, a clever painting designed to trick the faithful. This accusation, made within just a few years of its first exhibition, set the stage for a debate that would rage for centuries. It was a birth into the world marked by both profound devotion and deep skepticism. For nearly 100 years, the shroud remained with de Charny's descendants in Liari, but its fate was about to change dramatically. In 1453, the cloth was acquired by the powerful and wealthy House of Savoy. This Italian royal family recognized its immense value, both as a spiritual relic and a political symbol. They housed it in their capital at Chambéry, in a specially built chapel, elevating its status from a local curiosity to a treasured possession of European royalty. It was under their care that the shroud would face its first great trial. In 1532, a devastating fire broke out in the Sainte-Chapelle of Chambéry. The flames threatened to completely consume the fragile linen. It was saved in the nick of time, but not before it suffered severe damage. a drop of molten silver from the reliquary that held it burned through the folded cloth, creating a series of identical, symmetrical scorch marks. When the fire was finally extinguished, the water used to douse the flames left its own calling card in the form of large, distinctive water stains. These scars, still clearly visible today, became a permanent part of the Shroud story, a testament to its brush with destruction. The Savoy family's next move would give the relic the name we know it by today. In 1578, the shroud was moved to the city of Turin, a new seat of Savoy power. It was placed in the royal chapel of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, a magnificent new home for a now celebrated relic. This move was strategic, cementing Turin's status as a major center of faith and power. And there, in that cathedral, it has remained for centuries, surviving wars, revolutions, and endless scientific scrutiny, becoming an inseparable part of the city's identity and a fixed point in a world of constant change. So let's take a moment to truly see this object, to understand what has inspired both reverence and doubt for generations. The Shroud of Turin is a single, large piece of linen cloth, measuring approximately 14.3 feet long by 3.7 feet wide. It's woven in a sophisticated herringbone twill pattern, a detail that itself speaks to a certain quality and expense, the kind of fine linen that might have been owned by someone of means in the ancient world. Upon this pale, off-white fabric rests the faint, sepia-toned image that has made it famous. It is not a portrait in the traditional sense, but something far more strange and compelling, a full-length negative impression of a human form. The figure is presented in two views, laid out head-to-head as if the body was placed on its back on one half of the cloth, which was then folded over the top to completely envelop it from head to toe. This creates a haunting double image, the front of the body on one side, the back on the other, meeting at the crown of the head. The man depicted is naked, well-proportioned and muscular, with a beard, a mustache, and long hair that flows back from the face. His hands are folded modestly over the groin, but it is the details of his suffering that are most arresting. The entire body is covered with what appear to be scores of small, dumbbell-shaped wounds, consistent with the type of scourging inflicted by Roman flagrums. There are clear marks on the wrists, not the palms, which historical and anatomical studies suggest are the true points of suspension in crucifixion, capable of supporting the body's weight. On the head are numerous puncture wounds, as if from a cap of sharp thorns. Most striking of all is a large, elliptical wound on the right side of the chest, from which a large stain flows down the rib cage. The properties of this stain are crucial. It appears to be separated into a clear halo and a darker center, which forensic pathologists interpret as serous fluid surrounding a core of clotted blood, a sign that this wound was inflicted after death. Every element of this image, from the placement of the wounds to the blood flow patterns, tells a story of extreme torment and a brutal end, a story that aligns with the historical accounts of a Roman crucifixion. This is not a generalized symbol of suffering. It is a specific, graphic, and deeply human record. For centuries, the faint, ghostly image on the shroud could only be seen with the naked eye, a vague and puzzling impression that left much to the imagination. That all changed in the spring of 1898, when an amateur photographer and lawyer named Secondo Pia was given an unprecedented opportunity. The shroud was to be displayed in Turin Cathedral for a special public exhibition, and Pia was commissioned to take the very first photographs of the relic. He was granted a small window of time after the closing ceremonies, working late into the night of May 28th under the dim, flickering light of arc lamps. Setting up his large, bulky camera before the cloth, Pia took two separate exposures, one for 14 minutes and another for a full 20. The process was painstaking, and he later admitted he was nearly overcome with emotion simply being in such close proximity to the sacred object. He carefully packed his glass negative plates and retreated to his darkroom to develop them, expecting to see a faint, ghostly impression not unlike what he had witnessed with his own eyes. What happened next would forever alter the course of the Shroud's history, as the chemicals in his developing tray slowly began to work their magic. An image started to emerge on the plate. But it was not the faint, positive image he had anticipated. Instead, staring back at him from the glass was a face of startling clarity and depth. It was a positive image, a lifelike, detailed portrait of a serene and suffering man. The faint markings on the actual cloth had translated on his negative plate into a perfectly recognizable human likeness, with light and shadow reversed. In that electrifying moment, Pierre realized the incredible truth. The image on the shroud itself was a perfect natural negative. The relic wasn't just bearing a picture, it was the picture. It was as if the cloth itself was the original photographic plate, a snapshot frozen in time centuries before the invention of the camera. The implications of this discovery were nothing short of revolutionary. It meant that the human eye had only ever seen an inverted version of the shroud's true image. The negative revealed details that were otherwise invisible, the precise features of the face, the clear flow of blood, the three-dimensional quality of the wounds. Pierre's photograph transformed the shroud from an object of devotional curiosity into a first-class scientific mystery. How could a medieval forger, working over 500 years before photography was dreamed of, have possibly created a perfect negative image? Such a concept would have been not just technologically impossible but utterly meaningless to an artist of that time. The image's properties defied all known artistic techniques. Paints and dyes would sit on top of the linen fibers, but the shroud's image only penetrates the very topmost microfibers, with no directionality or brush strokes, as if it were created by a brief, intense burst of energy that caused a subtle change in the cloth itself. Secondo Pierre's accidental discovery didn't solve the mystery of the shroud. It deepened it beyond measure, opening a door to questions about its origin that we are still struggling to answer today. For 5 days and nights in October of 1978, the normally serene Cathedral of Turin was transformed into a buzzing, high-tech laboratory. Under the watchful eyes of church officials and security guards, a team of over 30 American scientists and technicians worked around the clock, their equipment casting an unusual glow in the sacred space. This was the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, a hand-picked group of physicists, chemists, pathologists, and imaging experts from prestigious institutions like NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Los Alamos National Laboratory. They weren't theologians or historians, they were hard-nosed researchers, and they had one single, focused mission: to subject the shroud to the most rigorous, non-destructive scientific analysis ever attempted, using tools that simply didn't exist just a decade before. Their goal wasn't to prove or disprove its authenticity as a holy relic, but to answer a much more fundamental and tantalizing question: how was this image made? The team brought with them over 2 tons of the most advanced analytical equipment available. They set up massive X-ray fluorescence units to study elemental composition, powerful spectrometers to analyze the chemistry of the image fibers, and highly sensitive microscopes to examine the cloth at a level of detail never before possible. They took thousands of photographs in various wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared, hoping to tease out secrets invisible to the human eye. Every test was meticulously planned to be completely non-invasive. Not a single thread would be cut or harmed. This wasn't a casual examination. It was a scientific siege, a full frontal assault on the mystery, using every tool modern science could bring to bear. For 120 consecutive hours, the scientists worked in shifts, driven by a shared sense of awe and intense curiosity. They were the first people in history to be granted such intimate, uninterrupted access to the shroud, and the gravity of the moment was not lost on them. They weren't just studying an old piece of cloth, they were interacting with a profound enigma. What they discovered in those 5 days would form the core of the scientific debate for decades to come. providing a wealth of data that was both startling and, in some ways, deeply perplexing. Their findings would challenge easy explanations and push the boundaries of what we understand about both art and science. After meticulously analyzing every square inch of the cloth, the STURP team arrived at a conclusion that was both definitive and deeply puzzling. They could state with an extremely high degree of scientific certainty what the image on the shroud was not. It was not a painting. This wasn't a tentative hypothesis. It was a finding rooted in a mountain of data from their ultraviolet and infrared spectroscopy, their microscopic analysis, and their chemical tests. They scanned the entire surface looking for the telltale signs of an artist's hand, the residue of pigments, the binding media that holds paint together, the directional strokes of a brush. They found absolutely nothing. No ochre, no vermilion, no lead white, no charcoal. None of the mineral-based or organic pigments common to medieval art were present on the image fibers. Even more compelling was the evidence from ultraviolet fluorescence photography. When they bathed the shroud in UV light, they made a crucial discovery. The areas of the cloth that were stained by water from the 1532 fire glowed with a bright fluorescence, as did the bloodstains. This was expected, as organic materials often fluoresce. But the critical part of the image, the faint sepia-toned body image itself, remained completely dark. It did not fluoresce at all. This was a massive clue. If the image had been created by any organic substance, like a plant-based dye or a thin layer of paint, it would have absorbed the UV light and re-emitted it as a glow. The complete absence of fluorescence was a powerful argument against the image being any form of applied substance. Under the microscope, the mystery only deepened. They examined individual linen fibers from the image areas and compared them to fibers from the non-image background and from the obvious bloodstains. The blood was clearly caked on top of the threads, even clogging the spaces between them, which is exactly what you would expect from real blood seepage. But the body image was something else entirely. Each individual fiber that appeared darker in the image was only colored on its very topmost layer, the outermost micron of the thread. The coloration didn't penetrate the fiber, and it didn't saturate the spaces between the threads. It was an incredibly superficial change, almost like a very delicate scorch, but without the brittleness or caramelization of actual burning. This finding completely dismantled the idea of a liquid-based application. A liquid pigment, dye, or stain would have been drawn into the fibers by capillary action. It would have wicked along the threads, creating blurry edges and a much more diffuse image. It would have pooled in the spaces between the threads. The shroud image shows none of that. Its edges are razor sharp, and the image itself has an almost photographic quality, with a continuous tone that varies in intensity. The team also looked for any sign of directionality, a hint that a tool like a brush or a cloth had been used to apply something. They found zero evidence. The coloration was completely uniform across each individual fiber, with no brushing pattern or streaking. It was as if the image was projected onto the cloth, affecting only the precise points it touched without any physical contact. The STURP team, a group of skeptical scientists who had entered the project expecting to find evidence of a clever forgery, were left baffled. They had successfully eliminated every known artistic method from the medieval period, and even some modern ones, but in doing so, they had only amplified the central, haunting question. If it wasn't paint and it wasn't a stain, then what mysterious process could have created such a precise, superficial, and photographically negative image on a piece of ancient linen? This incredibly shallow nature of the image formation is what truly separates the shroud from any known artistic work. The coloration isn't a layer of something on top of the linen. It's actually a chemical change within the cellulose fibers themselves. Each microscopic flax fiber is essentially a tiny, straw-like tube. On the non-image parts of the cloth, these tubes are a pale, creamy white. but on the image areas, only the absolute outermost surface of these microfibers has undergone a change. It's a phenomenon the scientists described as a selective, superficial degradation or oxidation. The cellulose in those topmost layers has been altered, dehydrated, and aged in a way that causes it to yellow very slightly, creating the faint sepia-toned impression we see. It's as if those specific points on the cloth were very rapidly aged by an unknown process, while the fibers a fraction of a millimeter below and all the surrounding areas remained completely untouched. Think of it like this: if you were to take a brand new piece of parchment and leave it in a sunny window for 100 years, the surface would slowly yellow and become brittle. That's a uniform overall aging process. Now, imagine if you could take a laser and use it to age only the very topmost molecules of that parchment, and you could do it with such precision that you could draw a perfect photorealistic portrait with varying shades of yellow, all without ever burning, charring, or even touching the material beneath. That's the level of precision and control we're talking about with the Shroud's image. It's a form of control that seems to defy not just medieval technology, but arguably even our own. This finding effectively rules out the possibility of a scorch from a heated statue or bas-relief, a theory that has been proposed. A scorch, even a very light one, would cause a different kind of chemical change. It would caramelize the sugars in the linen, making the fibers brittle and brown. It would also likely penetrate deeper than a single micron and would show gradients consistent with heat transfer. The shroud fibers show no such brittleness or caramelization. The change is a stable form of oxidation. Furthermore, for a scorch to create the continuous tone, three-dimensional information encoded in the image, the heated statue would have to somehow vary its temperature with incredible precision across its entire surface, matching the exact distance between the cloth and the statue at every single point to produce the correct shade of yellow. It's a physical improbability that stretches credulity, so we are left with a positive scientific finding that is, in its own way, just as mysterious as the negative ones. We now know what the image is, a precise, superficial oxidation of the topmost cellulose fibers, but the how remains a complete enigma. What force or energy could cause such a specific, microscopic change? What process could project a perfect, life-sized, negative human image with varying intensity onto a cloth without any contact, without any liquid, and without any discernible application method? The STURP team's final report, published after years of analysis, concluded with a now famous statement that the image is that of a real human form of a scourged and crucified man, that it was not produced by an artist, and that the specific chemical and physical properties of the image remain unknown. They could describe the effect in minute detail, but the cause continued to elude them, transforming the shroud from a question of art history into a profound scientific puzzle. But if the body image itself is a profound mystery, the story told by the blood is perhaps even more compelling, because here, science seems to provide answers that are startlingly clear. While the faint sepia body image is a surface-level change to the linen fibers, the bloodstains are something entirely different. They are a tangible substance, something applied to the cloth, and this gave the STURP scientists something concrete to analyze. Their findings in this area would become some of the most powerful evidence in the entire shroud debate. Under high-resolution microscopes, the blood evidence was impossible to ignore. The reddish-brown stain showed clear, specific physical characteristics that are the hallmarks of real human blood. The substance was caked on top of the linen threads, even clogging the spaces between them. It had flaked off in certain areas, and it had clearly seeped into the fibers, which is exactly what you would expect from a viscous liquid like blood soaking into a cloth. This was in stark contrast to the body image, which, as we discussed, only affected the topmost micron of the threads without any saturation. The physical behavior of the bloodstains was perfectly consistent with a liquid being absorbed into fabric. The chemical tests provided even more stunning results. Using a technique called microspectrophotometry, the scientists analyzed the light-absorbing properties of the bloodstains. The absorption spectrum they recorded was a perfect match for hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in red blood cells. They also found that the stains gave a positive test for the protein albumin, a key component of blood serum. Furthermore, immunologic tests provided strong evidence for the presence of human hemoglobin. While these tests couldn't definitively prove it was 2,000-year-old blood from a specific person, they did confirm that the stains were composed of real blood components, not iron oxide paint or any other medieval pigment that skeptics had proposed. Perhaps the most damning evidence against the forgery theory, however, is a subtle forensic detail that would have been completely unknown in the Middle Ages. Surrounding many of the bloodstains, particularly the large wound on the side and the scourge marks, is a clear, faint yellowish ring. This is known as a serum halo. To understand its significance, we need to know a little about how real blood behaves when it leaves the body. Whole blood is made up of red cells, white cells, and platelets, all suspended in a liquid called serum. When blood clots, the red and white cells contract into a dense clot, and the clear, yellowish serum is squeezed out to the edges. This is exactly what we see on the shroud. The dark, reddish-brown center of each bloodstain is the clotted mass of blood cells. Encircling it is the faint ring of serum that was extruded as the clot retracted. This is a natural biochemical process that a medieval forger would have had absolutely no way of knowing about. The science of serology simply did not exist. An artist painting what he thought blood looked like would have simply used a single shade of red or brown. He would never have thought to add a thin, clear, yellowish halo around every single wound because he wouldn't have known it was there. The presence of these serum halos is a powerful indicator that the shroud was in contact with real bleeding wounds. The evidence becomes even more precise when we look at the blood flows themselves. The patterns are anatomically perfect. The stains from the wrist wounds run down the arms at an angle consistent with the arms being positioned over the head on a cross. The blood from the scalp wounds from the crown of thorns flows in rivulets that follow the contours of the head and neck, even pooling at the small of the back, which is exactly what would happen if a person were upright. The flow from the lance wound in the side moves diagonally across the back, matching the posture of a crucified body. These aren't random daubs of paint, they are a forensic roadmap of torture and death, recorded with an accuracy that argues powerfully against fabrication. The combination of chemical proof and impeccable anatomical detail creates a compelling case that the blood on the shroud is not the work of an artist's brush, but the tragic and very real residue of a human crucifixion. Just as the secrets of the image and the blood were being unlocked through modern science, another line of inquiry was opening up, one that sought to trace the shroud's journey not through chemistry, but through the silent, ancient dust clinging to its threads. In 1973, a unique opportunity arose. The shroud was being examined for a historic exhibition, and among the experts present was a Swiss criminologist and botanist named Max Frey. A man accustomed to solving mysteries through the minute traces left at crime scenes, Frey was granted permission to do something unprecedented. Using clear adhesive tape, he gently pressed against the surface of the linen, collecting 62 samples of the microscopic debris that had settled into the fabric over the centuries. It was a simple act, but it would launch a botanical detective story that continues to intrigue researchers to this day. Back in his laboratory in Zurich, Frey meticulously analyzed his samples under a powerful microscope. What he found was a hidden world trapped on those sticky tapes, a collection of pollen grains and plant spores so diverse it was like a miniature archaeological site. Pollen is incredibly durable, often surviving for millennia with its distinctive shape intact, and each plant species produces a pollen grain with a unique and identifiable structure. For a palynologist, a scientist who studies pollen, these tiny particles can act as a geographical fingerprint, revealing the specific regions where a cloth has been exposed to the open air. When Frey published his initial findings, they were astonishing. He claimed to have identified pollen from dozens of plant species. Most intriguingly, these species weren't all native to a single European location. A significant portion of the pollen, he argued, came from plants that grow only in a very specific and limited area, the region around Jerusalem. This included plants like the tumbleweed Gundelia tournefortii and the desert shrub Zygophyllum dumasum. Frey's analysis seemed to place the shroud squarely in the Holy Land at some point in its history, but the pollen trail didn't stop there. He also reported finding grains from plants native to the steppes of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, and of course from the areas of France and Italy where the shroud's history is well documented. It was as if his microscope had revealed a map, seemingly charting the relic's path from the Middle East through Turkey and finally into Europe. This evidence was seized upon by those who believed in the shroud's authenticity. Here, they argued, was objective scientific proof that supported the traditional history of the cloth. The pollen from Jerusalem seemed to corroborate the idea that the shroud originated there, while the Turkish pollen appeared to align with historical accounts of the cloth's presence in Edessa and Constantinople, cities that were major centers of the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia. It was a narrative that made perfect sense, connecting the scientific data directly to the shroud's legendary journey before its documented appearance in France. However, the pollen evidence, like almost every other aspect of the shroud, soon became mired in controversy. The first major challenge arose after Max Frey's death in 1983. Other scientists requested access to his original microscope slides for independent verification, but they were reportedly lost, making it impossible to directly confirm or refute his specific identifications. This lack of transparency cast a long shadow over his work. Furthermore, critics pointed out a potential for significant contamination. The shroud had been handled for centuries, displayed publicly on numerous occasions, and even carried in processions. Could the pollen have come from the hands of pilgrims, from the air in the cathedrals where it was kept, or from other textiles it had contacted? Frey himself argued that the specific distribution and deep embedding of the pollen grains he found suggested they were ancient and original to the cloth's early history, not modern contaminants. But this assertion was difficult to prove conclusively without the original samples. The debate took another turn when other researchers, including Israeli botanists, attempted to replicate Frey's findings. Some supported the identification of the key Jerusalem area species, adding their own credibility to the claim. Others, however, were far more skeptical. They questioned whether some of the pollen grains had been correctly identified, suggesting that similar-looking grains from European plants could have been mistaken for Middle Eastern ones. The most significant blow came from a re-examination of the few remaining tape samples that were preserved after Frey's death. In 2017, a team of researchers using modern methods reported that they could not confirm the presence of the critical Jerusalem-specific pollens. Their analysis pointed toward a much more European-centric pollen profile, which would align with the shroud's known history in France and Italy, but would sever its alleged botanical link to the Holy Land. Today, the pollen evidence remains a fascinating but deeply ambiguous chapter in the shroud story. It represents a compelling hypothesis, a potential roadmap written in microscopic particles that has proven incredibly difficult to verify with absolute certainty. The initial excitement it generated has been tempered by legitimate scientific skepticism and the inherent challenges of studying a unique and fragile artifact. Whether it ultimately proves a historical journey or a case of accidental contamination, the pollen research underscores a central theme of the entire shroud enigma. Every potential answer seems to open up a new set of questions, leaving us with a puzzle that is as complex and layered as the ancient linen itself. By the late 1980s, the scientific investigation of the shroud had reached a fever pitch. The findings from the STURP team had deepened the mystery, suggesting the image was no medieval painting, but they had stopped short of providing a definitive age for the cloth itself. The world demanded a clear, objective, and scientifically irrefutable answer. The pressure was immense, and all eyes turned to a technology that had revolutionized archaeology: radiocarbon dating. This was the tool that could finally cut through centuries of debate and deliver a verdict written in the immutable decay of carbon atoms. The stage was set for what many believed would be the final chapter in the story of the Shroud of Turin. The plan that was formulated was designed to be beyond reproach, a model of scientific rigor and transparency. The Vatican, which had custody of the shroud, gave its permission for a destructive test, a momentous decision. A single, small sample of linen would be cut from the shroud and divided among 3 of the world's most prestigious and independent laboratories: the University of Oxford in England, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and the University of Arizona in Tucson. This triple-blind approach was meant to ensure that no single lab could sway the results. Their findings would have to converge to be considered valid. The location chosen for the sample was a solitary, unassuming corner of the cloth, far from the main image area, away from the obvious water stains and fire repairs from 1532. The selection was made with the utmost care to find what was believed to be the most pristine, uncontaminated piece of the original fabric possible. On the morning of April 21, 1988, in a tense and solemn ceremony in the sacristy of Turin Cathedral, the sample was taken. The Archbishop of Turin looked on as an expert textile conservator, using sterile tools, carefully cut a long, thin strip of linen measuring approximately 1 centimeter by 7 centimeters from the corner of the shroud. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of history in the making. This tiny piece of fabric, weighing mere milligrams, was then sealed in a container and entrusted to representatives from the British Museum, who would act as independent overseers for the entire process. Their task was to divide the sample into 3 coded segments, along with 3 control samples of known age, and send them to the labs. The scientists in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson would have no idea which sample was which. They were simply handed numbered pieces of cloth and asked to determine their age. The system was designed to be foolproof, a fortress against bias and error. For months, the labs worked in isolation, painstakingly cleaning their samples, burning them in specially designed ovens, and counting the remaining radioactive carbon-14 atoms. The world waited. Finally, in October of 1988, the results were compiled and unveiled at a packed press conference in Turin. The collective findings of the 3 labs were unanimous and stunningly precise. They dated the flax used to weave the Shroud of Turin to a period between 1260 and 1390 AD, with a 95% confidence level. In other words, the cloth was medieval. The radiocarbon dating declared with the full authority of modern science that the shroud was a creation of the 13th or 14th century. It could not possibly be 2,000 years old. For many, especially in the media and the academic world, the case was closed. The mystery was solved. The shroud was, as Bishop Henry de Poitiers had suspected 6 centuries earlier, a clever forgery. The headline that swept across the globe was simple and devastating: "The Shroud of Turin is a fake." The announcement sent shockwaves around the world. The journal Nature, one of the most respected scientific publications on the planet, published the findings in February of 1989 with a definitive and seemingly unassailable conclusion. With a 95% confidence level, the radiocarbon dating placed the origin of the shroud's linen between the years 1260 and 1390 AD. This time frame struck like a perfectly aimed arrow at the very heart of the pro-authenticity argument. It placed the creation of the cloth squarely in the middle of the 14th century, just a few years before its first documented appearance in Liéry, France in 1354. For the vast majority of the scientific establishment and the global media, the case was not just closed, it was slammed shut. The Shroud of Turin was officially declared a medieval forgery, an audacious and brilliant fake. The headlines were merciless and absolute. Newspapers and magazines across the globe ran with variations of the same stunning verdict. Science decrees Holy Shroud a fake. Dated, the Shroud of Turin is a forgery. Carbon tests prove relic is medieval. The narrative was clean, simple, and incredibly powerful. Modern, objective science had finally cut through 2,000 years of faith and superstition to deliver a cold, hard truth. The mystery was solved. The collective sigh of disappointment from believers was palpable, while skeptics and secular commentators felt a powerful sense of vindication. The carbon dating results were presented not as a single piece of evidence to be weighed against others, but as the final, definitive word that rendered all previous debates obsolete. The decades of compelling research from the STURP team, the baffling negative image, the forensic details of the blood, the unknown chemical process, were suddenly pushed to the sidelines, dismissed as interesting curiosities that were ultimately irrelevant in the face of the carbon clock's verdict. For the public, this was the story that stuck. The nuance of scientific inquiry was lost in the clear, crisp, and devastatingly simple message. Science had proven it was a fake. The shroud was demoted in the popular imagination from a profound enigma to a mere historical artifact, a testament not to divine power but to human ingenuity and perhaps gullibility. The question was no longer, how was this miraculous image created, but rather, who was the genius artist who managed to fool millions for over 600 years? The focus shifted entirely to the medieval period, with art historians and researchers now tasked with identifying potential forgers and the ingenious, lost techniques they might have used. The carbon dating had not just provided a date, it had completely reframed the entire narrative, seemingly bringing a centuries-long story to a decisive and abrupt end. Yet for many scientists, historians, and believers, the story was far from over. The carbon dating results, while authoritative, were not the final word they appeared to be. Almost immediately, a chorus of dissenting voices arose, challenging the methodology and the fundamental assumption that the tiny sample was truly representative of the entire cloth. These critics argued that the celebrated test might not have dated the original shroud at all, but instead had measured something entirely different, centuries of contamination. One of the most compelling rebuttals is known as the invisible reweaving or invisible mending theory. Proponents of this idea point directly to the shroud's brutal history, specifically the fire of 1532. They argue that the corner from which the sample was taken was not a pristine, untouched part of the original fabric, but was in fact one of the areas most severely damaged by the fire and the subsequent water used to extinguish it. In the years following the fire, the Poor Clare nuns who were entrusted with the shroud's care are historically documented to have performed meticulous repairs on the damaged relic. They patched the holes caused by the molten silver and rewoven areas scorched by the intense heat. The theory suggests that the sample sent to the labs was not a pure piece of 1st century linen, but a cleverly blended mixture of original threads and 16th century repair threads. This wasn't a crude patch, it was an expert, nearly invisible weaving technique where new threads were skillfully intertwined with the old to reinforce the fragile, burnt areas. To the naked eye, and even to the scientist selecting the sample, this corner would have looked continuous and original, but under a microscope, the truth might be revealed. If the carbon dating labs burned a sample that was, for example, 50% original threads and 50% newer repair threads from the 1530s, the resulting date would be a weighted average, dramatically skewing the result toward the more recent material. In essence, the test may have accurately dated the repair work, not the shroud itself. Beyond the possibility of physical repairs, other researchers have proposed more subtle forms of contamination that could have fooled the radiocarbon process. One hypothesis centers on the idea of a microbial biofilm. Over centuries of handling and public display, the shroud would have been exposed to a vast array of bacteria and fungi. These microorganisms and their waste products could have built up a thin, invisible layer of modern carbon on the surface of the linen fibers. Radiocarbon dating measures all the carbon in a sample. If this biofilm was not completely removed by the standard cleaning protocols used in 1988, protocols designed for pottery and bone, not for delicate protein-bound contaminants on textiles, then the modern carbon from these microbes would have diluted the sample, making the flax appear hundreds of years younger than it actually was. Another fascinating theory involves the chemistry of the 1532 fire itself. The blaze, which burned in a silver reliquary, would have produced massive amounts of smoke and gases. Among these was carbon monoxide. Laboratory experiments have shown that carbon monoxide can bind to the cellulose in linen textiles, a process known as carboxylation. This bonds newer, modern carbon atoms directly onto the ancient fibers. If this occurred, the radiocarbon dating process would have measured this contaminated outer layer, again yielding a falsely young age. The standard cleaning methods used in 1988, which involved solvents and acids, were not designed to remove this type of chemical bond. They effectively wash away surface dirt but cannot strip away atoms that have become chemically fused to the material itself. These persistent challenges, raised by credentialed chemists and textile experts, have ensured that the carbon dating results are not the unchallenged verdict they first appeared to be. They represent a major piece of evidence, but one that exists within a complex web of other scientific data that seems to point in the opposite direction. The debate is kept alive not by faith alone, but by legitimate, ongoing scientific inquiry into the potential flaws of a single test when applied to an object with such a unique and traumatic history. The question is no longer simply, what is the date, but what exactly did we date? If the carbon dating result was the final word, then the shroud's journey should begin in medieval France. But what if we found a map, drawn long before that journey was supposed to have started, that already showed the destination in perfect detail? This is precisely the enigma presented by a remarkable medieval manuscript known as the Hungarian Pray Codex. This book, a collection of prayers and hymns, is confidently dated by historians and paleographers to between 1192 and 1195 AD. That's a full 60 years before the earliest possible date assigned by the controversial carbon dating tests. And within its pages, we don't find a written description of the shroud, we find a picture of it. The illustrations in the codex depict scenes from the death and burial of Christ, but the artist didn't rely on standard medieval iconography. Instead, the drawings show something very specific and deeply unusual. In one image, we see the body of Jesus being prepared for burial. He is completely naked, which is itself a stark departure from the traditional draped or loinclothed figures common in contemporary art. His hands are crossed over the groin in a specific posture, and here's the first critical detail. Only 4 fingers are visible on the left hand. This isn't an artistic error, it's an accurate reflection of the shroud's image, where the thumbs are retracted and hidden, likely due to nerve damage from the nails, giving the appearance of a 4-fingered hand. This precise anatomical quirk, unknown to medieval artists, is perfectly captured in the Pray Codex illustration a century before the shroud's official history begins. The most jaw-dropping evidence, however, comes from the depiction of the burial cloth itself. The artist has drawn a series of small, identical burn holes on the linen. These aren't random dots, they are arranged in a very distinct reverse L-shaped pattern. This pattern is not mentioned in any gospel account or religious text. It is a unique, accidental feature of one specific cloth, the Shroud of Turin, which bears this exact pattern of holes, believed to be from a later incense burn in the very same location. The correspondence is so precise that it defies coincidence. The Pray Codex doesn't just show a similar shroud, it shows the shroud with its most peculiar identifying marks, rendered decades before the flax for the Turin cloth was supposedly even grown according to carbon dating. This creates an intellectual paradox that is difficult to resolve. How could a Hungarian illuminator in the 12th century have illustrated the exact, unique characteristics of an object that science would later claim did not yet exist? The presence of the Pray Codex suggests one of two startling possibilities. Either the carbon dating result is fundamentally flawed and the shroud is much older than 1390, or the shroud itself is a copy of an earlier, now lost cloth that possessed these same highly specific features: the peculiar hand placement, the four-finger appearance, and the unique burn hole pattern. Either scenario completely upends the simple narrative of a 14th century forgery. The Pray Codex stands as a silent, ancient witness, testifying from the distant past that the mystery of the shroud is far more complex and much older than we have been led to believe. This connection between cloth and coin is one of the most visually compelling arguments for the shroud's ancient origin. For centuries, Byzantine coins depicted emperors, symbols of power, and occasionally pagan gods. But a radical shift occurred around the year 692 during the reign of Emperor Justinian II. For the very first time in history, the face of Jesus Christ himself appeared on imperial currency, specifically on the gold solidus, the most prestigious coin of the empire. This wasn't a generic, symbolic representation. It was a portrait with strikingly specific and unusual features. The Christ on these coins, known to historians as the Pantocrator type, has a very distinct visage. He possesses a long, narrow nose, large, wide-set eyes, a prominent forehead, and a full mustache that flows into a forked beard. But the most peculiar detail, the one that truly sets it apart, is the treatment of the hair. Two single, distinct strands fall down from the back of the head, dropping past the ears and resting on the neck. This is not how artists typically depicted hair. It's an oddly specific and realistic detail. The question that has baffled numismatists for years is this: what was the model for this revolutionary portrait? Where did the Byzantine mint masters get this specific image of Christ at a time when standardized Christian iconography was still developing? The answer, some scholars argue, is literally woven into the Shroud of Turin. If you place the face from the shroud side by side with the face on the Justinian solidus, the correlation is astonishing. They are a perfect match. The shroud image shows the same long nose, the same large, deep-set eyes, the same forked beard, and most tellingly, those two exact same single strands of hair falling down the neck. This is far beyond a general resemblance or a shared artistic style. It is a precise, point-for-point duplication of unique, idiosyncratic features that would be virtually impossible to invent independently. The implications of this are profound. If the coin is copying the shroud, or more likely, a copy of the shroud that was venerated in Constantinople, then the shroud must have already existed and been known to the imperial court by the year 692. This would push the provenance of the cloth back by at least 600 years before its documented appearance in France, completely obliterating the medieval carbon dating timeline. It suggests the shroud wasn't a 14th century creation, but was instead the revered Mandilion of Edessa, a legendary holy cloth believed to bear the image of Christ's face, which was brought to Constantinople in 944. The theory posits that this cloth, kept folded in a frame so that only the face was visible, served as the direct model for the coin's engravers, forever stamping the shroud's unique likeness onto the currency of an empire. This numismatic evidence doesn't just suggest the shroud is older. It provides a potential historical pathway for its journey and offers a tantalizing explanation for one of the most significant shifts in early Christian art. Yet just when we think we've reached the limits of the shroud's mystery, another layer of its profound strangeness is revealed, one that separates it so completely from the realm of art that it defies all conventional explanation. This breakthrough came not from a microscope or a chemical test, but from a piece of technology developed for a completely different purpose: space exploration. In the 1970s, as the STURP team was preparing for its full-scale investigation, a pair of scientists from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, curious about the shroud's photographic properties, decided to run an experiment. They took a standard photograph of the cloth and fed it into a device called a VP8 image analyzer. This machine was a precursor to modern image processing software, originally designed to enhance the three-dimensional topography of planetary surfaces from the flat, two-dimensional photographs sent back by space probes. Its function was to interpret variations in light and dark as variations in height and depth, turning a picture of the moon, for instance, into a detailed contour map of its craters and mountains. What they expected to see was a meaningless jumble of distorted shapes, because when you feed a normal photograph or a painting into the VP8, that is exactly what you get. A portrait of a face becomes a grotesque, lumpy mess because the machine interprets the artist's use of light and shadow, the dark shading in a nostril or the highlight on a cheekbone, as actual physical depressions and protrusions. An artist's technique is designed to trick the human eye into perceiving depth on a flat surface. It completely fools a machine that measures real depth. What happened when they fed the shroud's image into the analyzer was nothing short of earth-shattering. The machine did not produce a garbled, chaotic blob. Instead, it drew a picture of perfect, coherent, and breathtakingly normal human form. The face had a properly rounded forehead, a nose that projected correctly from the plane of the face, eye sockets that were recessed, and cheeks that sloped back naturally. The entire body was rendered in perfect, measurable 3 dimensions. The VP8 had successfully read the shroud's faint, discolored markings as precise altitude data. The intensity of the image at any given point, how dark or light it was, directly corresponded to the distance between that point on the cloth and the body it had covered. The darker the mark, the closer that part of the cloth had been to the skin. This is a property that is utterly unique in the entire world. No painting, drawing, or photograph possesses it. A photograph is a two-dimensional representation of light and shadow. It has no inherent depth information. The shroud's image is something else entirely. It is not a picture of a body. It is a topographical map from a body. Think of it like this. If you were to drape a wet sheet over a statue and let it dry, the cloth would conform to the statue's shape. You could then look at the dried, crumpled sheet and clearly see the form of the statue beneath. The shroud's image is the ghost of that process, but with one impossible difference. The linen itself is completely flat. It shows no physical deformations, no creases or wrinkles from being draped over a form. It is as pristine and two-dimensional as a tablecloth. Yet somehow, encoded onto its flat surface, is a perfect, measurable record of the three-dimensional object it once covered. It is as if the distance between the body and the cloth was captured and translated into a precise, varying chemical change across the linen surface. Science has no explanation for how this could have been achieved by human hands. A medieval forger would have had to possess a knowledge of advanced optical physics and computer-assisted image processing concepts that wouldn't be discovered for another 700 years. He wouldn't just be an artistic genius, he would need to be a time-traveling scientific savant. This single property of the shroud elevates it from a mere artifact to a data set, a physical object that contains information about a moment in space and time that we can measure and analyze but cannot begin to replicate. The VP8 analysis doesn't just suggest the shroud is authentic. It screams that it is real, presenting us with a puzzle that exists at the very frontier of our understanding of physics and chemistry. So if the shroud's image is a genuine first-century enigma created by a process we can't explain, the obvious challenge arises: could a brilliant medieval artist have somehow accomplished the impossible? For decades, this question has driven a fascinating subplot in the Shroud story. as scientists and skilled artisans have tried to step into the shoes of a hypothetical 14th century forger. Their goal is simple yet profound: to recreate the shroud's full suite of miraculous properties using only materials and methods available in the 1300s. The results of these experiments are telling, not for what they have achieved, but for what they have consistently failed to accomplish. One of the earliest and most persistent replication theories involves the use of a bas relief. The idea is elegant in its simplicity. An artist could have created a stone or wooden statue of a human form, perhaps even heating it. They would then have laid a wet linen cloth over this sculpted form, perhaps daubing it with a thin, translucent mixture of acid and pigment. As the cloth dried, the parts in closest contact with the statue would absorb more of the substance, creating a darker impression that corresponds to the body's contours. This method could, in theory, explain the image's negative quality and even its superficial nature, as the pigment would only touch the highest points of the cloth draped over the statue. When put to the test, however, the bas relief method falls short in critical ways. The resulting image lacks the photographic subtlety and continuous tone of the shroud. The transitions between light and dark are too abrupt, creating a stark, cartoonish effect rather than the soft, gradual shading that defines the actual relic. Most damningly, this technique completely fails to account for the shroud's most baffling property: its perfect three-dimensional information. A cloth draped over a statue would record the shape of that statue, but the resulting image would be distorted by the drape and fold of the fabric itself. The VP8 image analyzer would read these folds and wrinkles as massive, nonsensical cliffs and valleys on the human form. It would not produce the flawless, coherent three-dimensional map that the shroud provides. The bas relief theory creates an image of a three-dimensional object, but it does not encode precise, measurable distance data onto a flat, two-dimensional cloth. Other experimenters have turned to the power of light, specifically the sun. In a technique known as camera obscura, or sun projection, proponents suggest a forger could have used a lens or a pinhole to project an image of a model or a corpse onto a cloth treated with a light-sensitive chemical. Some ancient substances, like silver nitrate, are known to darken upon exposure to sunlight. If an artist had coated a linen with such a compound and then projected an image onto it for an extended period, a faint, negative image might form. This method scores points for creativity and for producing a true photographic negative, something no other technique can claim, but it too stumbles over the specifics. The image produced would be a standard photograph, lacking any inherent three-dimensional data. The sun projection process would also require impossibly long exposure times to work on the large scale of the shroud, likely requiring days of perfect, unwavering sunlight to create an image of such uniformity. Furthermore, this technique would almost certainly involve the use of chemicals that would leave behind detectable residues, the very pigments and compounds that the STURP team's exhaustive analysis conclusively proved were not present on the shroud. The method is an anachronism, a pre-invention of photography that still doesn't explain the object's most unique features. Perhaps the most dramatic replication attempt involves not paint or light, but radiation. This theory, often associated with the work of physicist Dr. John Jackson, proposes that the image was formed by a brief, intense burst of energy emanating from the body itself, a form of radiation that caused the superficial degradation of the linen fibers. Experiments with ultraviolet excimer lasers and short bursts of proton radiation have shown some promise, producing a coloration on linen that is extremely superficial, limited to the topmost microfibers, just like the shroud. This method is intriguing because it doesn't require any applied substances. It's a purely energetic process. Yet even this high-tech approach, far beyond medieval capabilities, cannot yet claim victory. While it can mimic the superficiality of the image, scientists have not been able to fine-tune such a burst of energy to project a perfect, life-sized, negative image with varying intensity across the entire cloth. The idea that a body could spontaneously emit a directional burst of radiation capable of creating such a precise picture remains in the realm of theoretical physics. And crucially, this radiation hypothesis does nothing to explain the bloodstains, which are clearly a separate, applied substance with their own complex forensic history. A radiation burst would have affected the blood as well, likely altering its chemistry, which the STURP analysis shows did not happen. The true failure of all replication attempts becomes clear when we demand a single method that can explain every characteristic of the shroud at once. An artist might get the negative image but not the three-dimensional encoding. A scientist might get the superficial fibrils but not the forensic perfection of the blood. Someone might approximate the blood flows but not the absence of pigments. No one has ever created a forgery that possesses the shroud's photographic negativity, its precise three-dimensional data, its chemically altered fibrils without any additives, its anatomically perfect bloodstains with serum halos, and its complete lack of directional brushstrokes or artistic technique, all on a single piece of linen. This is the insurmountable hurdle for the forgery theory. It requires us to believe in a medieval Leonardo da Vinci who was not only a master painter, but also a microbiologist who understood blood serum separation, a physicist who intuitively grasped three-dimensional topographical mapping, and a chemist who worked with methods that leave no trace of their existence. The failure to replicate the shroud in its entirety is, in its own way, one of the strongest arguments for its authenticity. It suggests that the creator of the image, whether divine or natural, had access to a technology or a phenomenon that we have yet to fully comprehend. To a trained medical professional, the image on the shroud is not a matter of faith or artistry. It is a detailed and harrowing clinical case study. Forensic pathologists and physicians who have examined the image describe a specific and brutal sequence of trauma that is entirely consistent with the historical practice of Roman crucifixion. What they see is not a symbolic representation of suffering, but a precise anatomical record of a real human death. The evidence begins with the countless marks covering the body from the shoulders down to the calves. These are not random scratches or artistic flourishes. They appear as small, dumbbell or figure eight-shaped wounds, often in groups of 2 or 3. This pattern is the unmistakable signature of a Roman flagrum, a whip specifically designed for torture. Unlike a simple leather strap, the flagrum had multiple thongs, each tipped with sharpened pieces of bone or lead known as scorpions. When swung by an experienced executioner, these weights would bite into the flesh, tearing out chunks and causing deep, bleeding contusions. The pattern on the shroud shows a terrifying accuracy, with the blows landing primarily on the back and the backs of the legs, as would be expected if the victim was bent over a post during the scourging. The sheer number of these wounds suggests a beating of extreme severity, one that would have pushed the victim into hypovolemic shock from blood loss even before the crucifixion began. Moving to the head, the evidence is equally specific. The scalp is dotted with numerous puncture wounds, with rivulets of blood flowing down from them. Crucially, these flows are not uniform. They follow the contours of the forehead, the temples, and the back of the neck, merging and separating in a way that is anatomically perfect for a person standing or sitting upright. This is not the haphazard application of a red pigment by an artist. It is the result of gravity acting on real blood from real wounds. The pattern strongly suggests the head was pierced by a cap of thorns, not merely a circlet. A cap would have driven sharp points deep into the scalp's rich network of blood vessels, causing the profuse bleeding clearly visible on the cloth. The most critical evidence, however, concerns the wounds of crucifixion itself. For centuries, traditional art depicted the nails of the cross driven through the palms of Jesus' hands. This artistic convention makes for a sympathetic image, but it is anatomically impossible. The bones and ligaments of the palm cannot support the weight of a human body hanging on a cross. The hands would simply tear open. The shroud, however, shows the nail wounds not in the palms but in the wrists. More precisely, forensic experts place the point of entry in the space of destot, a specific anatomical spot between the small bones of the wrist. This location is a medical necessity for crucifixion. A nail driven here would pass through a strong cluster of ligaments and tendons and could lock against the bone, creating a secure anchor point capable of supporting the body's weight. This precise anatomical knowledge was completely unknown to medieval artists or physicians. It is a detail that only modern forensic science has confirmed, and its presence on the shroud is a powerful argument against forgery. Further evidence of a real death abounds. The face shows a markedly swollen cheek and a distorted, apparently broken nose. This is consistent with a violent blow from a blunt object. The legs appear muscular but not emaciated, indicating the victim was in good physical condition prior to the ordeal, but did not survive on the cross long enough to succumb to starvation. Most telling of all is the large, elliptical wound on the right side of the chest between the 5th and 6th ribs. This wound has a complex stain pattern that forensic pathologists interpret with striking clarity. The darker central area is clotted blood, but it is surrounded by a larger, clearer stain with a distinct border. This is a classic serum halo, the clear fluid of blood that separates and is extruded from a clot after death. This single detail is a forensic miracle. It proves conclusively that the wound was inflicted post-mortem. A lance thrust into the side of a dead body would release this serum-rich fluid, while a wound on a living person would gush with fresh, whole blood. A medieval forger, no matter how brilliant, could not have possibly known about this subtle biochemical process that only modern medicine understands. When all this evidence is compiled, the specific scourge marks, the cap of thorns, the anatomically correct nail placement, the post-mortem blood flow, the conclusion from a strictly medical standpoint is inescapable. The Shroud of Turin bears the image of a real human male who was brutally scourged, crowned with thorns, and crucified in a manner perfectly consistent with 1st century Roman practices. The image is a detailed autopsy report written in linen and blood, a silent witness to an act of extreme torture that carries the ring of truth in every agonizing detail. Given this overwhelming and perplexing body of evidence, one might expect the owner of the shroud to have a definitive stance on its authenticity. Yet the official position of the Catholic Church, which has been the shroud's custodian since the 1980s, is one of deliberate and thoughtful neutrality. The Church has never formally pronounced the shroud as the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Instead, it recognizes the relic for what it has undeniably become, a powerful and profound icon of Christ's passion. This distinction is crucial. An icon, in the religious sense, is not valued for its physical provenance, but for its ability to point the faithful toward a deeper spiritual truth. The Church venerates the shroud not because it is definitively proven to be 1st century linen, but because for millions of believers across centuries, it has served as a uniquely moving representation of the suffering and death of Jesus. It is an object that inspires prayer, reflection, and a tangible connection to the central story of the Christian faith. This carefully balanced position allows the Church to honor the immense devotional significance of the shroud while gracefully sidestepping the endless scientific debate surrounding its origin. By leaving the question of its historical authenticity to scientists and researchers, the Church effectively separates the realms of faith and science. It acknowledges that faith does not require scientific validation to be valid, and that scientific inquiry should be free to pursue its course without doctrinal pressure. This approach is not indecisiveness, it is a profound theological statement about the nature of belief itself. The Church's primary interest lies in the shroud's fruitfulness for devotion, not in its carbon date. This stance protects the faithful from having their belief shaken by any future scientific discovery, while also protecting science from being co-opted for religious apologetics. In its role as custodian, the Church has taken its responsibilities with the utmost seriousness. The preservation and conservation of the fragile linen are treated as a sacred duty. The shroud is housed in a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled reliquary in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, designed to protect it from further damage from light, pollution, and humidity. Public exhibitions, known as ostensions, are rare and meticulously planned events, sometimes occurring decades apart, to minimize the stress of handling and display on the ancient textile. Every decision regarding its care is made with a long-term view, prioritizing the object's survival for future generations over any short-term desire for public access. This custodianship is exercised with a deep sense of reverence for the object itself, regardless of its ultimate origin. Perhaps the most compelling demonstration of the Church's open-handed approach has been its permission for extensive scientific testing. From the in-depth analysis by the STURP team in 1978 to the controversial radiocarbon dating a decade later, Church authorities have consistently granted access to researchers from a wide array of disciplines. This permission was not given lightly. It involved weighing the potential risks to the cloth against the value of knowledge. The decision to allow the carbon dating test, which required the destruction of a small sample, was particularly agonizing. This willingness to engage with science, even when the results could be, and were deeply challenging to popular belief, demonstrates a commitment to intellectual honesty. The Church's position is not one of blind faith, but of a faith that is unafraid of questions, confident that truth, whether discovered in a laboratory or a cathedral, is ultimately one and the same. For centuries, the shroud had been more than just a single piece of linen. It was a complex textile sandwich, a layered history of damage and repair. Following the devastating fire of 1532, the Poor Clare nuns had painstakingly patched the holes burned by molten silver. Then, in 1534, to stabilize the entire fragile cloth, they had sewn it onto a large backing of sturdy Holland cloth, a strong linen often used for support in restoration. This backing had become part of the shroud's identity, its unseen foundation for over 460 years. But by the turn of the 21st century, concerns were growing among textile conservators. The patches were seen by some as a historical distraction, and there were worries about the long-term stability of the entire assembly. This set the stage for one of the most contentious chapters in the shroud's modern history, the 2002 restoration. The project was placed in the hands of Mechthild Fleury Lemberg, a highly respected Swiss textile conservator with an impeccable reputation. Her approach was rooted in classical textile restoration principles. In secret, high-security sessions, she and her team carefully cut the 30 patches from the 1532 fire, removing the historical repairs that had been part of the shroud story for nearly half a millennium. Then they undertook the most drastic step. They completely removed the original 16-thread stitching and the entire Holland cloth backing that had been attached in 1534. In its place, they sewed a new, custom-made linen backing to the shroud using an entirely new stitching pattern. They also inserted a new reinforcing strip of linen called the Holland cloth along the entire length of the shroud where it would be held during displays. For Fleury Lemberg, this was a necessary act of conservation, removing non-original materials to preserve the core relic itself and ensure its structural integrity for future centuries. However, to many scientists and historians who had spent their careers studying the shroud, this intervention was not conservation. It was an irreversible catastrophe. Their outrage was immediate and profound. The primary point of contention was the Holland cloth backing itself. For decades, scientists like the late Max Frey had argued that this backing, sewn on just 2 years after the fire, had acted as a pristine time capsule. They believed that dust, pollen, and other microscopic debris that had settled on the shroud in its earliest known locations, perhaps even in Jerusalem and Constantinople, would have been trapped and preserved between the original linen and this 16th century backing, safe from contamination by later handling. By removing and discarding this backing, critics argued, Fleury Lemberg had potentially thrown away a unique archaeological archive, a hidden map of the shroud's journey written in dust, which could have been analyzed with modern forensic techniques that didn't even exist when the backing was sewn on. The criticism extended beyond the lost evidence to the physical alterations made to the cloth itself. The removal of the patches and the original stitching, and the application of the new backing with a different tension, fundamentally changed the mechanical properties of the shroud. The cloth now lies flatter and has a different drape and handle than it did for the previous 5 centuries. For researchers who had spent years meticulously mapping every crease, fold, and water stain, this was a disaster. Their baseline data, used for understanding how the image might have formed or how the cloth had been stored, was suddenly rendered obsolete. The shroud they had studied for so long was, in a very real physical sense, gone, replaced by a stabilized but altered version. The restoration, undertaken with the best of intentions, had the effect of erasing a layer of the shroud's history and permanently changing its physical character, leaving the scientific community divided and many of its key members feeling that a priceless opportunity to finally understand the enigmatic cloth had been lost forever. If the investigations of the late 20th century opened the door to the shroud's mysteries, the digital tools of the 21st century have allowed us to step through it and examine the very weave of the linen under a virtual microscope. The transition from physical sampling to non-invasive pixel-level analysis represents a quantum leap in our ability to study the cloth without ever touching it. High-resolution, multi-spectral digital photography now allows researchers to scrutinize the shroud in astonishing detail from anywhere in the world, capturing every fiber, every stain, and every subtle variation in the image's intensity with a clarity that was once unimaginable. This isn't just about taking better pictures, it's about deconstructing the relic into a massive dataset of visual information, a digital twin that can be analyzed, measured, and probed indefinitely without risking damage to the fragile original. This computational power has breathed new life into the chemical analysis of the image fibers. Techniques like Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, or STURP, and Raman spectroscopy, which were in their infancy during the STURP era, have now been refined to exquisite sensitivity. These methods work by shining specific wavelengths of light onto a material and analyzing the unique way that light is absorbed or scattered. Each chemical bond vibrates at a characteristic frequency, creating a spectral fingerprint that is as unique as a barcode. When applied to the shroud, these spectroscopic techniques have consistently reinforced STURP's most baffling conclusion. They find no spectral evidence of any known pigment, dye, stain, or organic medium that could account for the body image. The signature they detect is not that of an applied substance, but rather a chemical change consistent with the oxidation and dehydration of the cellulose itself, a finding that continues to rule out artistic intervention and deepens the puzzle of the image origin. Perhaps the most exciting frontier of modern research lies in advanced digital image processing. Scientists are now applying sophisticated algorithms designed for medical imaging and satellite reconnaissance to the high-resolution scans of the shroud. Their goal is to extract hidden information embedded within the faint, sepia-toned imprint. By isolating and subtracting the complex background, noise of the linen's weave, the water stains, and the fire damage, researchers can digitally enhance the underlying body image to a degree never before possible. This process is revealing subtleties in the shading and definition that were previously invisible, offering a clearer view of the features and the potential mechanisms that created them. These digital tools are also being used to perform a kind of virtual archaeology on the cloth itself. By creating precise three-dimensional maps of the image's intensity, researchers can model how the cloth might have been draped over the body, testing various hypotheses about its position and the formation of the image. This isn't just about seeing the man more clearly. It's about understanding the spatial relationship between the body and the cloth at the moment the image was formed, a relationship that holds the key to the entire enigma. Each new algorithm, each new pass of digital filtering, brings us a little closer to the truth, proving that even after centuries of scrutiny, the Shroud of Turin still has secrets to yield to those who know how to ask the right questions in the language of the digital age. And so we arrive at the outer boundaries of the Shroud's mystery, where established science begins to blur with the realms of speculation and the truly extraordinary. When a phenomenon defies conventional explanation for so long, it inevitably becomes a canvas for our most imaginative hypotheses. One of the most scientifically intriguing, though highly speculative, theories proposes that the image was not formed by human hands or divine intervention, but by a freak act of nature. This idea centers on the possibility that a powerful burst of radiation, perhaps from a rare geological event, could have scorched the image onto the cloth. Proponents of this theory point to the peculiar properties of the image itself, its superficial nature, its precision, and its negative photographic quality as hallmarks of a radiological process. They suggest that if the body lying within the shroud was in close contact with certain types of rock, like limestone, which is common in Jerusalem tombs, a seismic event such as a major earthquake could have generated a phenomenon called piezoelectricality. Under immense tectonic pressure, certain crystalline rocks can release brief but intense bursts of electromagnetic energy, including ultraviolet light or even particle radiation. In this scenario, such a burst emanating from the ground beneath the tomb could have acted like a flashbulb, projecting the body's image upwards and onto the covering shroud in a fraction of a second, chemically altering only the topmost fibers. For many, this theory offers a tantalizingly natural, if incredibly rare, mechanism that could align with both the image's unique characteristics and the biblical account of an earthquake accompanying the resurrection. It is an attempt to find a bridge between the miraculous and the measurable, a more theologically oriented version of this radiation hypothesis moves from the geological to the metaphysical. Some scientists and theologians have proposed that the moment of resurrection itself, conceived as a transformative event of immense power, could have released a blinding flash of light or a burst of unknown energy from within the body. This energy, they suggest, was not destructive but precisely calibrated, a directional burst that selectively aged the linen fibers in perfect correspondence to the distance from the body, thereby etching a perfect three-dimensional negative. This idea directly confronts the central paradox of the Shroud, its combination of a brutally physical, forensic record of death with a creation process that seems to defy all known physics. It posits that the event which reversed death was so powerful that it left a permanent physical imprint on the very fabric of reality, a literal snapshot of a transition between states of being. While this theory is, by its nature, untestable by the scientific method, it represents a profound effort to reconcile the object's physical data with a faith-based narrative, suggesting that the resurrection was not a quiet, spiritual metaphor but a cataclysmic physical event that left behind tangible evidence. On the opposite end of the spectrum lies a theory that is far more popular in the public imagination but collapses under the slightest historical scrutiny: the idea that the Shroud was the work of the ultimate Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci. The appeal is obvious. Da Vinci was a certified genius, a master artist, an ingenious inventor, and a man fascinated with optics, anatomy, and secrets. Surely, if anyone in history could have engineered such an astonishing forgery, it would be him. Some versions of the tale even suggest he used an early form of photography, a camera obscura, perhaps projecting an image onto linen treated with a light-sensitive substance. Others propose he created a sculpture and used a clever rubbing or etching technique. The romantic notion of history's greatest painter crafting its greatest deception is a compelling story. However, this seductive theory has one insurmountable flaw: time. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452. The Shroud of Turin, or the cloth that would become known as such, was already being publicly venerated and already being denounced as a fake by a local bishop in the French town of Liéry in 1354. That is a full century before Leonardo was even born. The documented history of the cloth is extensive and continuous from the mid-14th century onward, with it being in the possession of the House of Savoy long before Leonardo took his first breath. The theory requires us to believe that the shroud that existed for over 100 years was somehow replaced by a perfect replica created by da Vinci, for which there is not a single shred of historical evidence, no mention in his extensive notebooks, and no record of a commission. While it's fun to speculate about hidden codes and secret projects, the Leonardo theory is a historical impossibility, a classic case of a famous name being attached to an ancient mystery simply because his genius seems equal to the task regardless of the actual timeline. These alternative theories, from the seismic to the artistic, highlight a fundamental human need to explain the inexplicable. They show us that the shroud's enigma is so powerful that it pulls at the edges of every field it touches: physics, geology, history, and theology, challenging us to think bigger and look deeper. Yet they also serve to throw the mainstream scientific debate into sharper relief. The ongoing research into more plausible, if still unproven, naturalistic explanations, or the continued questioning of the radiocarbon dating, represents a rigorous, evidence-based pursuit of understanding. It operates within the boundaries of what can be tested, measured, and peer-reviewed. The existence of these fringe ideas doesn't diminish that serious work. Instead, it underscores just how extraordinary the shroud truly is. An ordinary object inspires ordinary questions. The Shroud of Turin, by provoking questions that span from the labs of particle physicists to the pages of medieval history books, proves itself to be anything but ordinary. Yet the shroud's influence extends far beyond the quiet contemplation of a cathedral or the hushed debates of a laboratory. It has exploded into the vibrant chaos of popular culture, transforming from a sacred relic into a global icon that captivates imaginations regardless of personal faith. Its journey into the modern zeitgeist began most profoundly in the world of art, where for centuries it has served as the ultimate reference for depictions of Jesus. The haunting, serene face captured in Second-Opier's photographic negative provided a startlingly human and specific template that displaced the more stylized and symbolic representations of the Byzantine and medieval eras. This was not an abstract concept of a savior. This was a man with a particular nose, a distinct jawline, and eyes that seemed to hold an unfathomable depth. Artists across the world, consciously or not, began replicating these features, making the shroud's visage the definitive face of Christ in Western art, from grand Renaissance altarpieces to the humble illustrations in family Bibles. It standardized an image that is now instantly recognizable to billions, making it perhaps the most influential artwork in human history, despite the fact that no one knows who or what the artist was. This pervasive cultural presence naturally bled into the storytelling mediums of the 20th and 21st centuries. The shroud's potent mix of mystery, history, and implied supernatural power makes it a perfect catalyst for fiction. In literature, it has been a central plot device in countless thrillers and mystery novels, from the papal intrigue of Maurice West's The Clowns of God to the apocalyptic conspiracies of Ian Caldwell's The Fifth Gospel. These stories tap into the public's fascination, using the shroud as a holy grail that promises to either prove divine existence or unleash an ancient, terrifying power. It represents the ultimate MacGuffin, an object of desire that drives characters forward through a web of secret societies, Vatican spies, and historical puzzles. Cinema and television have been even more eager to weave the Shroud into their narratives. It has appeared in everything from earnest documentaries to blockbuster action films. In the television series The X-Files, it was a relic with unexplained healing properties, perfectly aligning with the show's themes of fringe science and government concealment. A decade later, the History Channel drama Nightfall featured it as a key element in the mythology of the Templars, tying it to another of history's great mysteries. Perhaps most famously, the Shroud provided a direct inspiration for the climactic revelation in the blockbuster film, The Da Vinci Code, where a similar cloth plays a pivotal role, cementing the idea of a hidden, explosive truth buried within Christian artifacts in the mainstream imagination. These appearances consistently frame the Shroud not just as an old piece of cloth, but as a key, a piece of evidence that could shatter or redeem our understanding of the world. This transformation into a pop culture phenomenon highlights a fascinating shift in the Shroud's role in society. For many people today, its significance is no longer solely or even primarily theological. It has become a powerful symbol of enduring mystery itself. In a world that often feels thoroughly mapped, explained, and digitized, the Shroud stands as a stubborn reminder that some puzzles refuse to be solved. It represents the thrilling possibility that the past still holds secrets capable of Chinese letter ing the present. It connects to our deep-seated love for conspiracy theories, ancient astronauts, and forensic detective stories because it is the ultimate cold case. It blends the languages of science and the sacred, making it a rare bridge between seemingly opposed worldviews. Whether one sees it as a divine miracle, an astronomical accident, or the work of a forgotten genius, the Shroud of Turin commands attention. It has transcended its origins to become a universal story, a canvas onto which we project our deepest questions about life, death, history, and the tantalizing possibility that there is far more to our existence than we currently understand. So after this incredible journey through history, science, and faith, we are ultimately left standing exactly where we began, in the presence of an unyielding and magnificent mystery. Every path of inquiry, from the microscopic to the monumental, seems to lead us back to the same handful of fundamental, unanswered questions. The core of the Shroud's enigma can be distilled into a single, profound puzzle: the origin of its image. How was it formed? This isn't a simple question of artistry or age. It's a multi-layered riddle that challenges our understanding of history, physics, and perhaps even reality itself. Let's first consider the possibility that it is a medieval creation, as the radiocarbon dating suggests. To accept this, we must believe that a forger, working over 600 years ago, accomplished the impossible. This individual would have needed to create a perfect photographic negative image on linen, a concept that wouldn't even be invented for another 5 centuries. They would have had to ensure this image was only 1 fiber deep, a feat of precision we can barely achieve with modern lasers, all without using any pigments, dyes, or binding media that would leave a detectable trace. This hypothetical genius would also need an encyclopedic knowledge of forensic pathology, understanding post-mortem blood clot retraction, and the precise formation of serum halos, details of biochemistry that were completely unknown until the 20th century. They would have had to know that crucifixion nails were driven through the wrists, not the palms, an anatomical fact lost to history and only rediscovered through modern medical science. And on top of all that, they would have had to somehow encode perfect, measurable 3-dimensional distance data into the varying intensity of the image, a property that no work of art before or since has ever possessed. The list of required skills is so vast and anachronistic that the forger becomes a more miraculous figure than the relic itself. It requires a suspension of disbelief that goes far beyond the realm of faith. On the other hand, if we entertain the possibility that the shroud is authentic and truly wrapped the body of a crucified man in 1st century Jerusalem, we are confronted with an equally baffling set of questions. What natural process could have caused this? Was it some forgotten chemical reaction between aloes, myrrh, and the compounds of a traumatized body? The STURP team ruled out all known naturalistic explanations involving liquids or vapors. Was it a burst of energy from a rare geological event, a piezoelectric flash from Jerusalem's limestone during an earthquake? While fascinating, this remains a speculative hypothesis with no proven mechanism for creating such a precise image. Or does the answer lie in the realm of the supernatural, in a moment of divine transformation so powerful that it left a permanent physical imprint on the fabric of space-time, a literal snapshot of resurrection? This explanation, while satisfying to faith, exists outside the boundaries of scientific inquiry, leaving the physical evidence without a physical cause. Each theory, whether natural or supernatural, seems to explain one piece of the puzzle while creating new questions elsewhere. The true, humbling conclusion after decades of intense, multidisciplinary study is that no single theory satisfactorily explains every single aspect of the shroud. The blood evidence points powerfully to authenticity, while the carbon dating points squarely to the Middle Ages. The image's properties defy artistic explanation, yet its formation process eludes scientific replication. It is a constellation of contradictions, a relic that refuses to conform to any single narrative. This isn't a sign of failure in the research. Rather, it is the defining characteristic of the shroud itself. Its enduring power doesn't come from a solved mystery, but from an ongoing dialogue, a constant, compelling tension between what we can prove, what we can believe, and what we have yet to understand. It stands as a permanent question mark, challenging our arrogance, inviting our wonder, and reminding us that some secrets are so profound they keep their truth no matter how hard we look. From its mysterious debut in a small French town to the high-tech scientific sieges of the modern era, the Shroud of Turin has taken us on an astonishing journey through time, faith, and reason. We've traced its perilous path from a knight's possession to a royal treasure, survived fire and scrutiny, and witnessed how a single photograph transformed it from a devotional object into a global scientific puzzle. We've seen teams of brilliant researchers baffled by an image with no pigment, no brushstrokes, and a hidden three-dimensional map. We've grappled with the stark contradiction of medieval carbon dates against the silent testimony of ancient coins and prayer books that seem to point to a far older origin. Every time a piece of the puzzle appears to snap into place, another shifts, ensuring the overall picture remains just out of reach. This is the enduring power of the shroud. It refuses to be categorized. It is a relic that lives in the liminal space between the definable worlds of history, science, and faith, challenging the very boundaries of each. For the historian, it is a document with an unverified provenance. For the scientist, it is an effect without a verifiable cause. For the believer, it is an icon of profound suffering and hope. It serves as a mirror, reflecting back at us our own deepest questions and the lens through which we choose to see the world. Its greatest mystery may not be how its image was formed, but why its silent, enigmatic presence continues to resonate so powerfully across centuries and cultures. Perhaps the answer lies in our innate human desire for connection to the profound. The shroud is the ultimate cold case, a tangible, physical link to one of the most pivotal stories in human history. It offers a chance to touch the edges of a narrative that has shaped civilizations, to examine the forensics of an event that billions hold sacred. It allows us to engage with the concept of the divine not through abstract theology, but through the empirical language of fibers, bloodstains, and light. In an age of easy answers and digital certainty, the shroud stands as a monument to mystery, a reminder that some questions are too big, too complex, and too wonderful to be solved by a single test or theory. It invites us not to certainty, but to wonder, to a humble and ongoing conversation about the nature of evidence, belief, and the timeless human search for meaning. We want to hear your voice in that conversation. After this deep dive into the evidence, the debates, and the unknowns, where do you land? Do you see the hand of a medieval genius, a freak of nature, or something that transcends our current understanding? Share your own thoughts and theories in the comments below. These discussions are what make exploring history's greatest mysteries so thrilling. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we have many more deep dives into the world's most captivating enigmas coming your way.